The game of basketball these days is a very chaotic and fast-paced game, full of three-point shots, dunks, beautiful and perfected jump shots, and well-tuned rules for regulation, such as court sizes, hoop height, and what qualifies a foul. But what did the game used to look like? As many of you know, basketball was invented all the way back in 1891 by James Naismith, which is why the Hall of Fame is named after him. However, it was created in a small gym to fill a physical education period, meaning the rules were simple and games weren't very long. When Naismith first made the game, he only had 13 rules. Some of them may seem similar to the current rules, and others, well, not so much. There are the obvious rules like what out of bounds is and what a foul is, except the game was fundamentally different. First of all, there was no dribbling in the first game of basketball. The ball could only be moved between passes. This is a very important change which we'll come back to later. Games also were only two 15-minute halves. This made the game incredibly slow, resulting in the first game only being 1-0. Yes, I did not stutter, I said 1-0. Every point was seen as 1 point. As many of you know, in the early years of basketball, there was no three-point line. But in the very first games, there was also no free throw line either. In fact, fouls worked much differently as well. Nowadays, what happens after a foul is easy. A player goes to the free throw line, they shoot it, and if they make it, it's 1 point. All players get 5 fouls until they foul out with 6, or foul out with 5 in FIBA. In the original rules, if another team fouls 3 times, the other team automatically gained 1 point. This may seem excessive, but you have to remember games were very slow, where games were almost never in double digits and each shot was only 1 point. What was considered a foul was also far more extreme, consisting of things like punching, pushing, and so on. So if someone on the other team has punched you or pushed you while you go up for a shot over and over, an extra point seems more than fair. Another weird rule is that the last person that touched the ball when it went out of bounds is the first one that has to inbound it. In the modern era, when a game goes out of bounds, there's a few seconds where teams decide who's going to inbound the ball, who's going to catch the ball, usually it being the point guard, or they even call a timeout and they draw up a play. However, back then, if number 5 is your best player and knocks it out of bounds, he can't catch it. 5 has to be the one to inbound it to someone else. The biggest rule change, however, is the difference in overtime. Today, if a team is tied by regulation, teams go to overtime for another couple minutes to see who wins that unless they tie again. In the early years of basketball, it was more of a sudden death approach, where teams had to mutually agree to go into overtime, and they would go until the next basket was made. That may seem like a really short overtime, but let me remind you, in the first full 30-minute game, the score again was only 1-0. Now this was the first ever game of basketball. But what if we skip a little while ahead to the first NBA game, where people were playing at a professional level with more defined rules? The first NBA game was played on November 1st, 1946. However, many may even argue this because technically there was still no NBA at this point, so we'll clarify and say the first professional basketball game. Throughout the years, there were several different basketball leagues, such as the BAA, NBL, and ABA, but that's a story for another video. Essentially, the BAA was what later become the NBA after combining the three. For their 75th anniversary, the NBA did a video over the first NBA game, One point they drove home was how hard it was to show that this was a professional sport. Colleges were already playing basketball, but no one took it as seriously as a higher level. The players had to show they were better than the college players, and the sport had to gain popularity against hockey, especially since the first game was up north with New York and Toronto, where hockey was very popular. However, let's take a look at this video that shows a college game from 1939.
At New York.
Before we even see anyone touch the ball, the year and setting gives you an idea of how old this is. This was during the World Wars and black and white film, where everyone in the crowd wore suits outside the house. The court as well looks very different. From this top-down view, we can see the court is not the rectangular shape we are all accustomed to, but actually square. The hoops as well are standing on two pole legs rather than the traditional hoop stand. The key also looked very different with just a circle and free throw line. Now that we play the video, let's take a look at what a jump shot looked like in 1939. Except, there was no jump shot. This was a set shot. This is just absurd. This wouldn't fly even in my youth basketball league. But this is how it was played back then. Now from the footage, a lot of shots may seem impressive, like half-court shots. However, you must remember that these courts were much smaller, as we just showed with the square court. Now these changes are all about the layout of the court, but what about how the actual game was played? Well, again, ESPN made a tribute to the first game, and we had the opportunity to see the footage of the first NBA game and break it apart. The first thing that you can see is again the time period, where everyone had to show up to the game in suits like businessmen, rather than nowadays where Harden, Russell Westbrook, Curry, all of them have their signature outfits leading into the locker room. As you can see, the pace was much slower with people walking on defense. Now this was to be expected, but what stood out to me was the passing. Remember when I said that there was no dribbling and we would get back to it later? Well, this is later. Once again, in the first rule set, dribbling was not allowed, and by looking at the footage, that seems to have really made an impact on playmaking. Dribbling was less important and your passing was more important. So you had to be able to fire the ball in between defenders, which evolved into players like Magic Johnson or even Jokic today with their passing ability. Today, you can look at any team and say who the first option is and who is going to dribble all the way up the court or have their hands on the ball the most. Back then, everyone was a point guard, making plays and passes, and there were no crazy tall centers that got rebounds and blocks. There is one rule, however, that even in 132 years has not changed at all. The first game of basketball was played on 10-foot rims. And despite court sizes changing, arenas expanding, and moving from small YMCA gyms to huge NBA championship stadiums, the hoop has always remained standing at 10 feet. Throughout the over 75 years of the NBA, the game has surely changed, and it's only going to change more. But no matter if you like these guys from the 40s, Wilt in the 60s, Larry Bird, Jordan, or LeBron, we can all share the love of basketball and the love of the 10-foot rim.
This is not okay. This needs to stop now.